Welcome to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM's POTUS.
Welcome to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM for Friday, January 10th. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm joined by RCP Washington Bureau Chief Carl Cannon and RCP White House correspondent Phil Wegman. So, Phil, let's start with President-elect Donald Trump. He was sentenced to an unconditional discharge this morning for his conviction last year on 34 separate charges of business fraud related to payments to Stormy Daniels during the 2016 presidential campaign. An unconditional discharge means Trump will not be imprisoned, he won't be fined, he doesn't face probation. But it does mean that when he takes the oath of office 10 days from now, he does so as a convicted felon. So Trump has vowed to keep fighting the conviction through the appeals court. But Phil, what do you make of today's events?
This is a Pyrrhic victory for Democrats who were hell-bent on arguing in the public square that Donald Trump was a convicted felon, that he was unworthy of the highest office in the nation. And then what do you know? The American people, they elect him anyway. So it was unable to stop the Trump train, but it will lead to a historical asterisk for his second term. One thing that I found remarkable is that at the sentencing, the president-elect actually spoke, and he didn't hold back. I mean, he said, I'm totally innocent. I did nothing wrong. He also said that the sentence was an embarrassment to the city of New York. And then he concluded, and I couldn't help but chuckle, after just laying into the judge, he concluded, I'd just like to explain that I was treated very, very unfairly. And thank you very much.
Carl, yeah, he spoke for about 7 minutes. This whole thing took about a half an hour. It was done virtually. And 7 minutes of it was Trump lambasting the court in New York and the prosecution and really, having his say. I mean, was not someone who was up there sort of penitent, thanking the judge for letting him off so easily.
No, he didn't thank the judge. But, the prosecutor said in his remarks that he's shown no remorse, and he's attacked the court. Well, for Trump to show remorse would have been hypocritical. His view, Trump's, is that this was a misdemeanor, if anything, probably not a misdemeanor, that he filled out this form. It's hush money. It's an NDA. It's a non-disclosure agreement. You wouldn't put in writing that you were paying a porn star because that would defeat the purpose of it. These records are not meant to ever be public. They are available to financial regulators. Byron York, I thought, had the most accurate description of it. The charge should be called lying to your own checkbook.
Right.
But even there, the money did go through Michael Cohen. So legal fees, it's a kind of a white lie. It's certainly not 34 felonies. And, Phil said that Trump will have an asterisk. He will be the first convicted felon to be inaugurated, but maybe not, because if the Supreme Court overturns this conviction, Trump seems to think they will, then it'll be vacated and he won't have been a felon. So it'll be, the asterisk will have to be removed. The case seems to a lot of people, not Trump people, a lot of Democrats, to be a disgrace. And this charge, this thing that may or may not be a misdemeanor, was elevated not into one felony, but 34, because there were 34 entries, by a prosecutor who ran for office, vowing to get Trump, who's presided over a city where we see one horrific crime on the subway after another, one horrific crime, in the streets after another. And this is how they spent their resources. The number 3 guy in the Justice Department went to work for Alvin Bragg. Now you're going to have Republicans doing investigations into whether there was collusion. Do we dare use that word, Andy? Collusion between the White House and the Alvin Bragg prosecution. It seems like a stain on the criminal justice system. Trump said the system was weaponized, and that seems pretty transparently true, that it was weaponized against him. It almost it sounds funny, but it almost seems like a civil rights violation. Donald Trump's targeted because of his political views.
But, to that point, though, Carl, talking about the Supreme Court, I mean, the Supreme Court decided yesterday that this 5-4 decision to allow this sentencing to go forward, John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett went along with the liberals on the court to allow it to happen. So the court did have an opportunity. If they wanted to step in right now, they could, but
that doesn't necessarily portend what will happen in the appeal of the conviction itself. John Roberts is an institutionalist. The jury has spoken. You're going to have this sentencing. I think the idea is to let it play out. And the other thing is, and because all the issues, there'll be more issues joined in the sentencing. And one of them was should Judge Merchan have recused himself?
Mm-hmm.
I think he should have. His daughter raises money for Democratic causes. She's raised money off Trump. Now, the recusal is if you have a direct conflict of interest, or and some people think it ought to be the perception of a conflict. There's certainly the perception of a conflict. And should Alvin Bragg's office even been allowed to prosecute it? There's all kinds of issues, deeper and more, sweeping legal issues that the court can look at. And to get one more vote, it seems to me that, I don't know. I don't want to predict that, but that's not the same thing. You could think that the case should play out, and then it should be, to use a phrase from Capitol Hill that we all know, regular order. Regular order would be right. You appeal after the sentence.
Yeah. So Phil, it will be appealed. And you used an interesting term earlier, a Pyrrhic victory, but it is a victory nonetheless of sorts for Democrats, isn't it? I mean, they do have at least one scalp after all these efforts. This is basically what they walk away with. They do have Trump, at least on the day of his inaugural, he will be a convicted criminal offender, right?
I don't know if I'd say it's a scalp so much as it's a neck. And had this been a very closely contested presidential election, then maybe they could feel better about themselves. But essentially what the voters said is they looked at this case. And then also, I think a lot of other voters looked at just all of the legal cases against Donald Trump. Normal people who don't have the luxury of cross-referencing the New York Times with the Wall Street Journal and Fox News with CNN. I think they just lump all of these together. And at this point, I think that they're going to look at this conviction and say, all right, well, so what? Certainly the American people have rejected the argument that Democrats were making generally, which was about Trump's character. And, we see some Democrats sort of moving away from the progressive project. So I don't know how much of a victory this is for them to hang their hat on, but I'm certain that MSNBC wine moms will love this conviction and God love them in return.
Well, but Andy, this lawfare, its result was to ensure Donald Trump's nomination. Now, their motivations, look, some of these prosecutors are just, Jack Smith, for all I know, he's just following the law. I heard nothing bad about that guy. Trump calls him deranged. I think that's ridiculous. I think that's a deranged description. Fonnie Willis is another whole kettle of fish. But Bragg's the worst, and this is just a clearly politically motivated thing, and it made it untenable for other Republicans to get traction. Tom Bevins pointed this out on our show. After these cases were joined, very hard for DeSantis. The bottom fell out of his support. Nikki Haley could never pick up the pieces. They got Trump nominated, and then he won the election. So independent voters have spoken where they are on lawfare. They don't like it. They're worried about it, and they should be. My own opinion, and I don't just usually give opinions. I like to do interpretation, but that's a little different. But I think this is as I say, a real stain on the criminal justice system. I think it breeds contempt for the third branch of government, and for the party that's running on preserving democracy to misuse the courts in this way. It undermined their whole argument. And I think Phil said some of them are walking away. I think in the end, most people will walk away from this. I think it was a disgrace.
Yeah. Well, I just in terms of, I'm sorry, Phil, go ahead.
Well, and just quickly, I mean, our reporting bore this out at the day of the very first conviction the very first indictment against Donald Trump. I was speaking with the Trump campaign pollster, John McLaughlin. He told me this is very good for us in the primary. And it shows that, yes, Democrats got their indictment. They thought that this was sort of setting him up to knock him down. It was going to help him in the primary. And Donald Trump and company, they sort of laughed all their way to a popular vote victory. This is what DeSantis told us was going to happen. He said that he thought Democrats were doing this intentionally. And it certainly seems, after all that reporting, that was the case.
Yeah. Well, the thing to note, too, at the very end of the whole half hour today, Judge Merchan turned to Trump and said, "I wish you Godspeed as you assume your second term in office," which shows a little bit of grace on his part, I think. So I was happy to see that. Anyway, you're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Phil and Carl. We're going to take a break, and we'll be right back after this.
This is Real Clear Politics on POTUS, Sirius XM Channel 124. Informed viewpoints spanning the ideological spectrum.
You're listening to Real Clear Politics on POTUS, Sirius XM Channel 124.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Phil and Carl. And Phil, California Governor Gavin Newsom is facing questions about whether the state was prepared for the wildfires now raging through Los Angeles. It's a human tragedy, but of course it has political implications for Newsom and other officials. What do you make of how the governor is handling the job so far?
You said it. Elon Musk, President-elect Trump, they're all arguing that Governor Newsom was asleep at the wheel. And today, when the California governor Skyped into the Oval Office for a meeting with President Biden, he argued that there were hurricane force winds of mis and disinformation about not just how this fire was started, but how California has responded. The reason why I find this particularly noteworthy is that this has really been one of the defining themes of the Biden presidency. It bookends his time in office. Obviously, during the election, you had the big tech giants sort of assisting the Biden campaign by censoring a true story about the Hunter Biden laptop. Then, during the pandemic days, this White House actively leaned on Facebook to take down posts that they thought were inaccurate. They said that these tech giants were killing people. That was the type of rhetoric that was used. And when I pressed then White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki on just some basic parameters or safeguards that were in place, they had no answers. Now, President Biden, he has said that one of his greatest regrets is not getting a handle on misinformation. I think that this is just night and day from the way that Republicans and the right is considering this issue. One man's misinformation is another man's First Amendment right.
Yeah. Carl, what do you make of...
Well, but what Gavin's talking about is some of the wild rumors that are going around about these fires. Nobody knows anything yet. But the idea that there's a tragedy in Los Angeles, these fires are raging as we're talking. 10 people already dead, thousands of homes burned. Rick Riley, who's a great Sports Illustrated writer, wrote in the Washington Post, it's the worst day in Los Angeles history. Well, no, that would have been the LA riots following the Rodney King verdicts. There were 1,000 buildings burned there, and they were all deliberately torched by arsonists. But this idea that we point fingers at the other party right away, Karen Bass, look, it's not a good look for the mayor to be in Ghana at some... What's she doing in Africa anyway? She's the mayor of Los Angeles. Okay. And then she comes back and sort of dodges questions. And people have unearthed these clips of one of the fire chiefs in LA, saying the priority is DEI. But Trump's they go way farther than that. It's Gavin Newsom's fault because he didn't bring all the water from Northern California to Southern California. Trump said he had some mythical agreement that Gavin Newsom pocket vetoed or something. Out of some weird nomenclature. This is not helpful. And I guess I'm not going to shock you, but I'm sympathetic to Gavin Newsom on this issue. He's these fires are, Andy, these fires are literally still burning, and we're trying to get partisan advantage. That's what happens with these school shootings. It happens with natural disasters. I think most Americans find it distasteful.
I take your point there. I think, Cannon, that it's always a bad look to try and win partisan advantage. That said, some of these interviews of Newsom where you have Anderson Cooper of CNN saying, why is it that these fire hydrants are empty? And Newsom's response is, that's a local problem. I think that some of these victims, and you know this better than I do, you've spent so much more time, this is your childhood state, but it seems awfully tone deaf for Newsom to then sort of point to the mistakes made at the municipal level. And, Newsom, rather than stand there and take the heat and defend his record, to redirect, these folks who have lost everything, they want to blame someone. And I think that might be the governor and the mayor there.
Right.
Well, there were $17 million cut from the fire department's budget. That's Karen Bass is going to have to answer that. But I'm just saying, let's get some facts. Let's put out the fires first. But there'll be time for this later. But
Yeah, I buy your point. However, two things. One, we are Real Clear Politics, so I think we're allowed to talk about the politics of anything we want, and there's no time stamp on
And we
that.
come out every day.
All right. And this I found this this was a quote from an article in The Hill today. This is from Mike Gatto, who is the former California Assembly member, and he said this about it. He said, "Whenever a region is unprepared, of course, it is the people in power who bear some of the blame for that lack of preparedness." And then he let me just finish. Let me finish the quote. He said, if they had their way, and he's talking about Gavin Newsom's team, of course they would wish that this was not happening at this time. It makes launching any type of national campaign a very difficult thing to do. So it's not just the Republicans who are thinking about the politics of this. Democrats are thinking about it as well.
Well, Gavin Newsom isn't talking about running for president, though.
Oh my God.
He has never talked about it, as far as I know. He was the most loyal surrogate to Biden that there was. He made one self-deprecating joke about, their highly democratic procedure to ending up with Kamala Harris, pretty mild compared to what some of the other side was saying. All I'm saying,
he has no national political ambitions.
I didn't say that. I said he's not talking about that. He's not. He's talking.
That's
just a fact.
There would have been an opportunity.
He didn't go down to Florida and run those ads.
I just don't understand
because he doesn't. I don't
know what I'm supposed to defend him for, because I don't know what he's being accused of. Ambition, sure. Yeah. We plead guilty, me and Gavin. Here's what I'm trying to say. This is the most. You had a drought. It hasn't rained since 8 months, I think. And the Santa Ana winds. I grew up with them. They weren't 100 miles an hour. Mm-hmm. So at least one of these fires, they now suspect arson. Let's just gather some facts before we start pointing fingers. Even here at Real Clear Politics, when we love to explore the political ramifications, I
was describing something that is happening out there. If you're saying we shouldn't talk about it, we're not the people pointing fingers at Gavin Newsom. Other people are pointing fingers at Gavin Newsom. We are reporting on that fact. I think that's a legitimate story for us to do.
And Susan Crabtree had a story on our front page yesterday. I commend it to everybody. Here are the questions that people want to know. Was the forest management neglectful? Did environmentalists cause that? Why was the budget of the fire department caught? I heard one person, she's a Democrat, a Hollywood person, say, fire is the number one problem here. Why would you cut the fire department? Legitimate question. Were the reservoirs not full? Should there have been more water pressure? These are all good questions to ask. I'm not saying they aren't. I'm saying that while buildings are on fire, burning, to presume you know all the answers already, just seems to me presumptuous of people. I'm not talking about you, Andy. I'm talking about some of these people on, social media, and the president-elect. I guess I'm talking about him.
Yeah. Well, Phil, we've just got about a minute left here. I did want to talk about TikTok. You're going to talk about that later in the program. So you know what? Let's not talk about TikTok. I want to talk a little bit more about Gavin Newsom. He is in polls that I've seen. He is number 2 in terms of Democrats' choice for next presidential run. He's behind Kamala Harris by about 30 points, but he's ahead of Pete Buttigieg and a lot of the other contenders. Carl, do you think this will have any impact on his ability, even though he doesn't want to be president, or he's never talked about it? Other people have talked about it. Do you think there's any chance that this hurts him or helps him?
I think that what unfolds over the next few weeks will impact his campaign. People aren't going to blame him for the fires. They are going to look at him carefully for his response to the fires, and they're going to see were there things that the governor could have done, and the mayor, but we're talking about Newsom, that the governor could have done that would have made it easier to fight these fires. I think those are relevant factors. I think that people will make up their minds for it, and I think Kamala Harris is probably glad she's not in statewide office right now.
Phil, you got 30 seconds. How do you view it?
I think that the reason that case will be evaluated is because Newsom did something very important previously. He was a team player. When Biden was down and out for the count, the governor, when the nomination was there for the taking, did not compete for it. Instead, he was a team player. He's ambitious, certainly, but he hasn't launched any type of campaign, to Cannon's earlier point.
Right. Well, good. We're going to have to leave it there, guys. Hey, I'm Andrew Walworth. I've been talking with Phil and Carl. This is Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM, but don't go away. We'll be right back after this.
It's real, it's clear, and it's on POTUS.
It's Real Clear Politics.
Sirius XM 124.
RealClearPolitics, a neutral, even-handed arbiter of political data. You're listening to POTUS, SiriusXM Channel 124.
Hello, and welcome back to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. I'm Philip Wegman, White House reporter for RCP, and I'm joined now by Michael Sabolic, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and the author of Countering China's Greatest Game. Michael, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So TikTok is currently fighting for its life at the Supreme Court as the Chinese-owned application, best known for dance videos and, viral cat memes, is trying to avoid a sale that Congress enforced last year through law. Do you think that a sale of TikTok is inevitable?
So if you listen to what TikTok argued before the Supreme Court today, they would say no to that question. And I found this particular exchange to be perhaps the most illuminating of the entire arguments during the oral arguments this morning. TikTok argued that it's essentially impossible for them to divest from ByteDance, for there to be any kind of a sale or a separation. And the reason they gave is kind of an encapsulation of the whole story. They said that it's impossible for them to separate because they have Chinese engineers who are working for ByteDance that control the source code, that originate the parameters for the algorithm. Those parameters are then sent from China to the United States, where TikTok US is. And they said it would take years and years and years to unravel that situation. TikTok and ByteDance, by design, are integrated in such a way that it's very difficult to remove them from each other. This is because the Chinese Communist Party wants to control TikTok for national security reasons. So in terms of where this is going, I am no lawyer, nor do I pretend to be one, but it seems to me that TikTok did not have a great day before the Supreme Court this morning. And the big question is, how quickly are we going to find out? Is it going to be before the 19th? Is it not? Nobody knows. But from what I can tell, my money is on the Supreme Court upholding the law.
Michael, we heard so much from TikTok's CEO in testimony before the House and the Senate, and they were insisting that there was a wall of separation between Chinese engineers and American data. Is there anything that we've learned as this case progressed about perhaps the veracity of those claims? Were they being completely honest with lawmakers?
No, of course they weren't. And this is a pattern with TikTok. They have their talking points, which are great for politics. But then when the debate went from the political world into the legal world, you had to bring the lawyers in. And there are legal consequences for lying in these court cases. And we've learned some things. We learned earlier on this past summer that TikTok said before US courts, the algorithm that they rely on is export controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So it's really difficult for them to separate. We learned that they rely on ByteDance engineers that are based in China to get access to the algorithm in the first place. So it's really interesting. Like when you have to tell the truth before a judge or a panel of justices, you get a different flavor for what reality is than when the people in the spin room are putting it together, the talking points. And the one other thing I'll say, Rutgers came out with a study within the past week, I think, and there is quantitative evidence when you compare Instagram to TikTok that like pro-Uyghur human rights content, any sort of speech about Tiananmen Square, about Taiwan, the representation on Instagram outpaces that on TikTok by orders of magnitude.
I wonder why.
We should ask ourselves why.
Looking at the American political front here, I'm struck by the fact that even as the Biden administration was warning American families that TikTok could potentially be a national security risk, President Biden couldn't quit it. He brought TikTok stars to the White House. He created an account himself. And Donald Trump doesn't have clean hands either. His administration tried to ban TikTok, and yet during election season, he joined it. So I guess the 30,000-foot question that I have for you, Michael, is if Washington, D.C. can't quit a video app because there are political benefits to them, I mean, how serious is the Republican and Democratic establishment about doing the actual hard things when it comes to countering China?
A few things here. Number one, what President Biden did with talking out of both sides of his mouth, I think it set a terrible example and complete mixed messages to Americans. And it helped TikTok as they cited the President Biden's presence on TikTok in their legal briefs to the DC Circuit Court as evidence that maybe they're not as threatening as people say they are. So that's inexcusable. President Trump, if you take him at his word, he's gone through a sort of evolution. He thinks TikTok is valuable politically, and he wants to find a way for it to remain operational while also taking care of the security concerns. That's not going to be easy to do, not impossible, but because of Beijing's export control on the algorithm, getting a US buyer isn't going to be hard. Like there are buyers waiting, credible buyers waiting in the wings right now who are interested, but getting to a situation where TikTok can separate, they probably won't be able to take that algorithm with them. So getting to that point is not impossible, but it's not going to be easy either. But to your broader question about how serious are we at kind of this meta analysis of DC China policy, we have problems. We have a few bright spots. I would say Speaker Johnson is emerged as a real leader on countering the Chinese Communist Party. Chairman Molinar of the House Select Committee on the CCP, another consequential leader on these efforts. But look at how Washington ended 2024. They tried to pass outbound investment restrictions on China. That collapsed in the Defense Authorization Act and in the continuing resolution. They also tried to legislate on prohibiting US biotechnology firms cooperating with Chinese biotechnology firms. That collapsed. And then there was some considerations about trade policy with loopholes that allowed Uyghur slave labor goods to come in here. That collapsed too. So we're having a bit of a trend where we are really good at identifying problems, but domestic politics is holding hostage national security priorities, and it's not good.
So let's talk about some of those bigger things in light of how it seems that both Republicans and Democrats have gotten good about talking about the problem, but they're lacking when it comes to actual policy prescriptions. You know, the incoming National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, has argued that we're already in a Cold War with China. The feeling is that the United States has been too reactive to the Chinese Communist Party's aggressions, but that, you know, we haven't been on offense. And so I'd like to ask you about the Panama Canal, Greenland, some of these other sort of grandiose suggestions from the president-elect. As you hear him make those calls for territorial expansion in light of the Chinese, I mean, do you see that as sort of the ramblings of a celebrity real estate tycoon, or are these the opening chess moves in a new strategic paradigm?
They're opening chess moves. And I think we should take Trump at his word. I think he is incredibly serious when he talks about Greenland. He's very serious. And I will add, he is on firm strategic footing when he talks about CCP threats in the Panama Canal. That's a real thing that he's getting at. This is not pie in the sky, like where did this come from kind of stuff. There are at least two ports on either side of the canal that are owned and operated by PRC companies. I think they're Hong Kong companies, but in reality, they're controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And the scenario that I think the president-elect is worried about and is almost certainly getting briefed on is in a crisis, say maybe a war in Taiwan erupts, and we have some naval assets in the Atlantic Ocean that we need to quickly move to the Pacific Ocean. The Panama Canal is essential in that scenario. If there's infrastructure and pre-positioned capabilities that Beijing has to not, even if they can't deny us from doing that, to delay us from doing it quickly, time matters. And that's an unacceptable security threat. So the stuff that the president-elect is talking about is real, it's valid, but I will also say, how he goes about doing this will be really important, because you better believe that as he starts to talk about Greenland more, Beijing is going to use that to say, well, how America feels about Greenland, we feel about Taiwan, you know? So like they are always looking for those angles to move forward this lie that America is no different from the CCP.
So some of the folks that I've talked to, they liken Trump's moves, or at least his expressions of interest in Greenland and the Panama Canal, as a throwback to the Monroe Doctrine, a throwback to the foreign policy of a John Quincy Adams, sort of carving out spheres of influence. Do you think that that is likely what he's doing here? Is this a retreat from the Indo-Pacific and more of an emphasis on our own backyard? I mean, is there perhaps a historical parallel to what we're seeing from the president-elect right now? Or, is this just, a return to more recent history, before we normalize relations with the Chinese?
I don't think it's a retreat away from our presence in the Indo-Pacific, although I think there are some in Washington who would try to move it in that direction. I think that would be a strategic mistake. But I don't know necessarily that the president-elect sees it that way. I do think that he sees it very much as a revitalization of the Monroe Doctrine. And like, let's be real, Beijing's presence in our own hemisphere is significant and has grown over the past decade. In particular, you look at El Salvador, like you talked about Panama, Argentina, Venezuela, and that's just a handful. They are picking off allies of Taiwan, but more than that, the Belt and Road Initiative has been expanding in Latin America. And that comes with more than just economic influence, it comes with political and military influence, which is not good. So President Trump is right that these are security issues. America should rightly be secure in our own hemisphere. How he goes about doing this is going to be really important. Negotiations are always tricky. They're going to be hard. There are going to be moments where it's very awkward, particularly with Denmark as it relates to Greenland. And we'll just have to figure this out. But we'll need to make sure that whereas the CCP believes in might making right, the process of how we go through this is going to matter a lot.
I think as I look to the second season of Donald Trump, I'm thinking about his first 4 years. And my question for you as an expert China analyst is, did Donald Trump identify the problem from 2016 to 2020, or did he actually put points on the board? Or is it both in terms of what was permanent the first time around? And then going forward, what are some top line areas given the status quo in Washington that we just discussed that he ought to pursue in terms of, permanent change, not just, some fleeting articulations?
I think Donald Trump in his first term had the best China policy of any American president since Richard Nixon. He did what no one has done, which is actually get a whole of government assessment that we needed a top-down reassessment of how we're approaching the People's Republic of China. And even before the COVID pandemic, which we all remember where COVID came from, even before the pandemic happened, you saw the executive branch and the whole of the Trump administration begin to reorient its approach to the PRC. The easiest example of that is in trade. I think how he leveraged tariffs was really strategic. I think he gets some unfair criticism for how he thinks through tariffs. Like, of course, it's an imperfect policy instrument. Of course, it's blunt, but it has a real net advantage for the United States because it removes the ability of China, which is a heavily export-based economy. It makes it more difficult for them to access one of the most valuable markets. And China has been overproducing for a long time. So a lot of it makes sense. That needs to be integrated with a broader strategy. And I do think, to his credit, he started to try to do that. And there were real points on the board that we scored in 2020 as a country, I think. So the key is going to be building on that success, building on that in the second term, and making sure the focus remains winning a Cold War.
Very good. Well, Michael, thank you for joining us. That's all the time that we've got, and it's a natural stopping point. You've been listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
This is Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics
on POTUS, Sirius XM Channel 124.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief of Real Clear Politics, talking now with Peter Berkowitz, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and a regular columnist for Real Clear Politics and one of the most thoughtful conservatives you'll ever meet. That's one thing I want to ask you about, Peter. In the post-Trump or current Trump environment, is Trump a conservative? And where is conservatism heading?
Those are very big questions. Is Trump a conservative? Where is conservatism heading? I don't think he's temperamentally a conservative, but a number of his public policies, number of his inclinations, a number of his analyses of where America's gone wrong intersect, converge with the conservative sensibility and the conservative movement. And we should say his slogan, his super successful slogan, "Make America Great Again," actually is itself essentially conservative. In what sense? It presupposes an origin for America. We were once great. There's something intrinsic to the American experiment in ordered liberty. We've lost something of it. We need to recapture it. It's quite conservative of him.
All right, hold on. I'm going
All
to
right,
jump in. I'm going to jump in here. A couple of
please.
things. First of all, I introduced myself properly. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief, Real Clear Politics. You're listening to us on Sirius XM Radio, POTUS Channel 124, or maybe watching on our podcast on RealClearPolitics.com. So, Peter, a hark back to days of yore has a conservative sort of feel to it. But then if it's accompanied by policies that are either antediluvian conservatism, like tariffs, which is like harks back to President Taft, or things that aren't and never have been conservative at all, aren't Trump's policies really what we should be talking about if we're going to judge whether this is really a conservative movement or rather or instead a populist takeover of the Republican Party?
We should, but we shouldn't lose sight of this one particular dimension. That dimension is the sense among a large swath of the country, around half of the country, judging by the election, that elements of American culture, of American education, of the American media have deviated dramatically from traditional American principles, starting with protection of freedom of speech, including the diversity, equity, and inclusion movement, which, as we've discussed, Carl, really is about imposing sameness and discriminating in order to favor historically discriminated against races. So that part of Trump actually really does coincide with genuine conservative concerns. As far as tariffs go, you might have added industrial policy. That doesn't seem very conservative.
I would add isolationism as well.
Isolationism, although that has some roots in the American conservative movement. But what we have to recognize here is that American conservatism has fractured. One could say there were always splits within it, but it's deeply fractured today. A new right has emerged, or sometimes it's called the New American Conservatism. That's the name given to it by Kevin Roberts, the head of the Heritage Foundation. And in this new conservatism, we see something that could reasonably be labeled big government conservatism. It is a conservatism that says in order to conserve, we cannot be cautious as Ronald Reagan was. We cannot simply rest on our laurels. We cannot simply put out fires. We got to use government to aggressively change course to save.
Now, Peter, you're listening to Peter Berkowitz, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, frequent columnist for Real Clear Politics. I'm Carl Cannon. Peter, you've written about this for us last couple of years, and I have to tell you, maybe because I remember Reagan so well. Earlier today, I was editing my father's memoir. He's Reagan's biographer. But, a Reaganite, and Reagan remade the Republican Party in his image, much as Donald Trump is trying to do. But he would have considered big government conservatism an oxymoron. And I suppose I do too. Talk me out of it.
Well, I can't talk you out of it, although I make one slight distinction. It would be better, instead of speaking about small government and big government, we should really talk about limited government and unlimited government. Because we got a big government because we're an enormous transcontinental nation of well over 300 million people with lots of responsibilities, a lot of complexity, industrial society. Government's going to be big. The question is, do we honor guardrails imposed by the Constitution on the exercise of government power? Reagan understood limited government. And the point worth emphasizing today is many of the new conservatives say we can't afford that. We need to be much more aggressive in the use of government power in order to right our wrongs. I would agree with you that any form of conservatism that disregards constitutional limitations on power, wants to set them aside or overcome them, is not only breaking with the spirit of Reagan, it's breaking with the spirit of what we most need to conserve, which is our constitutional tradition.
I was thinking this came up obliquely, what we're talking about now during the Supreme Court's arguments earlier today, the oral argument of the Supreme Court over the TikTok case. And conservatives are not united on this. Neither are liberals. Happily, it's an issue that people are coming to their conclusion based on the merits, based on their own philosophies, and not necessarily what party leaders are telling them to do, which is a nice break from the weird norm we're in. But there's a conservative argument for and against forcing TikTok to, either divest itself from China, completely divorce itself from China, or sell the company, right?
Yeah, and I want to emphasize this: the best argument for aggressive government intervention in the economy is a national security argument. Because without national security, without being able to defend ourselves from our foes, all the rest of our rights are not worth very much. So that still doesn't settle the TikTok question. The TikTok question will turn on an empirical judgment. To what extent does TikTok, controlled in one way or another, people suggest by the Chinese Communist Party, to what extent does it represent a real threat to America, both by disseminating messages to young people, and second, by collecting information from Americans?
So, Peter, we've got a few minutes left here, and I'd wanted to talk to you about Israel, but I'm going to have to have on next week because you've been to Israel recently. But I want to talk to you about the State Department. You worked there a couple of years under Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in the Trump administration. You and I are friends. I remember talking to you about it before you took the appointment. Your old job is now being taken over by Mike Anton, who's a mutual acquaintance of both of ours. I won't say friend, but he's a person we know and like. And, we don't always agree with his writing, but he's got this job. And you have a new State Department, a guy like Pompeo, actually, a person who was accomplished in other fields. He's not one of these people Donald Trump pulled out of left field, Marco Rubio, right? Maybe the choice nobody's really questioning. What is this? We got a couple minutes left. What are you looking for in a Marco Rubio run State Department? And how will your replacement, Mike Anton, well, he's not a direct replacement, but the job you used to have, how will he help? How can he help Marco Rubio enact his vision?
Yes.
All without running afoul of the Trump White House.
Yes, well, that's a tough one. Much easier to analyze the errors of the past than predict the future. You're right about Rubio. Not only is he an accomplished man, a United States senator, he is a Reaganite, I think, when it comes to foreign policy, meaning he has an understanding of the toughness of the world, and he wants to incorporate, to some extent, some reasonable extent, a respect for human rights into a responsible U.S. foreign policy. Now, if you look at other Trump national security appointments, they're consistent with that. Mike Waltz, who's been named the National Security Advisor, Trump's national security advisor, is like Trump. It's like Rubio, Trumpio. It's like Rubio. He's an Iran hawk, understanding Iran to be the central threat to Middle East stability. And he's a China hawk, recognizing China the central threat to stability around the world. That said, as we know, there are contrary tendencies that are very powerful within Trump world. And those tendencies go to a lesser footprint for the United States in the world. To some extent, our old buddy Mike Anton represents this trend. And I have to note something a bit unusual. Typically, the Secretary of State announces the appointment of the head of policy planning. In this case, it was Donald Trump who announced that he was appointing Mike Anton to serve as head of the policy planning staff.
Peter, he did the same thing at the Voice of America. He announced his new what's the senator from the woman who wanted to be a senator, Carrie Lake from Arizona, as the new Voice of America head. First of all, the job is already being held by an excellent person, Mike Abramowitz, and secondly, that'd be like naming your third base coach before you name the manager.
Yes, and it's not only like that. It's like the owner instead of the general manager making the announcement. So one could look at this optimistically and say the different sides of Donald Trump's sensibility will be well represented in the State Department. We also have to add that many of the top positions in the State Department have not yet been filled. Most of the undersecretary positions are still empty. Most of the regional assistant secretary positions Assistant Secretary for East Asia and the Pacific. That covers the region in which China dominates. Near Eastern Affairs, that covers the Iran-Israel region. That person hasn't been named. So before we can confidently say how the Rubio State Department is going to conduct diplomacy, we need to know a lot more about the appointments. But what we can say is that we should expect that the tensions we already see within Trump world, we ought to expect to see within the Rubio State Department.
Well, that's a good way to end on uncertainty, because we have all kinds of football games this weekend and we don't know how any of them are going to turn out either. That'll do it for us for the week. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief. You've been listening. I've been talking to Peter Berkowitz, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, a frequent columnist of ours. You've been listening to us either on SiriusXM Radio, POTUS channel 124, or watching on our podcast, Real Clear Politics. Have a great weekend, everyone.
The
Politics
of
the
United States.
This is POTUS on SiriusXM Channel 124.